we have would be great if it was just an application that only had a counter, but maybe we should clean this up a little bit to make it so that we can do multiple things in this application. So in the app module, I set up the application state there. Count is count reducer. I'm going to add an index.ts to the reducers folder and just kind of formalize this a bit. So first I'll export an interface. Remember, these are always just for TypeScript. JavaScript doesn't care about this. This will just make sure that TypeScript knows what we're talking about, or we know what we're talking about. And then, much like we had in the app module, I'm going to export an object called reducers, and we'll import that in. So in the interface, again, I'm going to tell TypeScript that there is a property called count, and it's a number because that's what our count is. And then in the reducers, I'm going to add a property here called counter, and that is going to be from my counter reducer. Now notice there's a mismatch there. Count and counter are spelled differently, and that would cause us weird runtime behavior. So NGRX has this action reducer map that you can use to detect those kind of things. Make sure you didn't spell things wrong, etc., etc. Now they match, and this should work just fine. Our JavaScript is in line with our TypeScript. In our app module, we'll get rid of that object literal for our reducers and import those reducers from our reducers folder, index.ts. Take a quick check, make sure we haven't broken anything. Oh, and glorious. We can still increment and decrement. Little cleaner behind the scenes, less fluff inside of our app module. If we look at the app component, the app component HTML, we have that little interface definition there again as an anonymous interface. So we'll just use that application state that we defined in our root reducer. And then another thing is that count is just a magic string there that could go wrong. So we're going to use another overload of select that lets you put in an anonymous function that says what data you want. And these are all refactoring, so our application looks dandy. Those little anonymous functions like that, those can become brittle too if you move things around in your state, etc. So I'm going to just throw that in my index.ts. That feels to me like that's the file that knows where this stuff is, knows how to get to it inside of our application state. So we create what's called a selector function. And I'm just going to tell it if you start at the state, eventually here, the application state, you can see this is just the same thing we had in our component, but now I'll use that in the component. I like to keep my components are busy. They have a lot to do. They're an important part of, maybe the most important part of Angular, and don't put a lot of logic or make them think much here. So we're going to put that select current, do a quick check, make sure we didn't break anything. Maybe eventually we'll need some automated tests, but for now, everything looks great. So what if we wanted to, right now our application, this is nested right in our app component. What if we wanted to isolate this into its own component? I'm going to generate a component for this called counter using the Angular CLI. And maybe I'll start by taking the HTML portion out of the template, moving it to this new component, little extract component refactoring here. So we're going to tell app component to show our counter in our counter component. We will put that HTML, and then we'll need to go grab the code out of app component.ts. So I'll just cut that out of there. We'll come back and clean that up in a moment. Replace the stuff in counter component.ts, add our imports. We need observable. We need the store. Need that application state. We can just add that one to the same import for the application state. And then for our actions, those are a aliased import. So I'll just retype that real quick. That's up a couple levels up in our actions. That looks good. And then go finish our cleanup in app component.ts. No longer need to implement that. We've got some extra imports we can get rid of. And we get a good build. Let's go see how it looks. Fantastic. So we isolated this in a component, but They are sharing application state. There's global state here. So if I create multiple instances of that component, you can see any one instance is modifying the state of another instance. Perhaps later we'll address ways to be able to do that if you wanted to do something crazy like have 100 counters on your screen that were each independent with from one another.